The files are located on the second floor, at the end of a long hallway. The fluorescent lights above flicker on and off. Open the door on the right. In the bottom drawer of a file cabinet, there it is, a folder labeled with 3 words that are poured onto stories. Stories of history, stories of people, stories of death. I'm Luke Poling, and this is Famous Last Words. Ladies and gentlemen, we present to you the epitome of romanticism in all of its heart-pumping, flustered, flushed, passionate forms. The man who was so captivating, he literally drove women and men mad. So intriguingly contrary, the world remains slightly obsessed. So totally goth that the word Byronic was coined for being alluringly dark, mysterious, and broody. May we welcome to the stage the man you've been waiting for, the insatiable Lord George Gordon Byron. Lord Byron was born on January 22, 1788, to Catherine Gordon and Captain Mad Jack Byron. Catherine was a Scottish heiress, and although Mad Jack came from some noble upbringings, with a name like Mad Jack, you can probably guess where the story goes. He quickly ran through all of his wife's money and died before young George was 3. Catherine was forced to take her young son from London back to her home in Scotland, where they lived meagerly. None too pleased with the way her life had gone, Catherine wasn't really known for being the best mother to George. Although he was a physically handsome young boy who turned into a dashing man, even by 21st century standards. Take one look at the Thomas Phillips portrait of him and you'll probably agree. He was born with a severely deformed foot that impaired his gait when he walked. This was completely unacceptable to Mom, and she tormented him because of it. At the age of 10, things began to look up when George received word that he had inherited the title of Lord Byron from his great-grandfather, the wicked Lord Byron. Man, this family really had a thing for cool nicknames. George and his mother moved back to England as the title came with financial stability and a manor house. The home had fallen into some disrepair, which made it the perfect spot for sparking the creativity of a burgeoning poetic genius just waiting to burst free, among lots of other things waiting to burst free from the passionate young man. Byron initially attended the Harrow School, and, interestingly, wasn't known for his educational prowess at the time. He was known for his love of extremes and tendencies of overdoing things. During this time, he also discovered that he really loved love. It is said that his first actual sexual experience was with his older maid at the manor house. How cliche can we get? She apparently taught him the ways around the bedroom and quoted Bible verse while she was at it. This will tend to mess with a guy's head, so it might be part of the reason why scholars of Byron note that, although he was a very good time and had an amazing joie de vivre, he also was saddled with immense guilt. This could also be from his mommy and daddy issues, but we're not psychologists over here, nor are we to judge. Especially because the first woman he factually fell in love with was his first cousin. And if we learned anything from our friend Percy, poets like to keep it in the family. In fairness, this particular cousin, Mary Chatsworth, was a distant one. But when she rejected her hero, as she was already engaged to someone else, the next person to capture his heart was in fact his half-sister, Augusta. As Byron goes through his life, there is a running theme of a draw, or fetish, if you will, for unattainable, ideal love. Byron entered Trinity College, Cambridge, in 1805, and began racking up the debts, as a trust fund college boys want to do, and he starts to experiment even more with his sexuality, throwing in a little bit of fluidity that he ends up practicing throughout the rest of his life, beginning in his affair with John Eddleston. Byron described his love affair with young Eddleston as being true and passionate, yet violent, which was often a theme in his escapades with the males he pursued. It is also at Cambridge where Byron really began to spring into action, and we mean a literary kind of action. He began publishing his poetry and started gaining recognition for his work, with his unique style which can't be pigeonholed. Sometimes broody, often prosaic, often satirical, Byron is unexpected, and the literary world around him are paying attention. Byron gained notoriety after his first published work, Hours of Idleness received a scathing review in the Edinburgh Review, to which Byron responded by writing a satirical critique on the literary scene called English Bards and Scotch Reviewers. He was also extremely driven for justice and became heavily intrigued by Whiggism. In 1809, Byron took his seat in the House of Lords and also embarked on a grand tour, traveling to spots such as Spain, Malta, Turkey, Greece, Lisbon, and even more. While he was on tour, he wrote Childe Harold's Pilgrimage and fell madly in love with what many say is the true love of his life, Greece. The book Childe Harold is a semi-autobiographical account of a disillusioned young nobleman traveling the globe while looking for meaning. Sound familiar? Its transparency and realism, mixed with the romanticism of the time, made it an incredibly potent work and captivated audiences. Byron described its reception as, "I woke up one morning and found myself famous." Byron's seemingly overnight success led him to many more adventures and would soon pull him into the vortex of our previously mentioned bizarre love rhombus. The fame of it all, upon his return, swept around him as the toast of Whig society, and straight into a hearty romp with that eccentric, seductive, and slightly off-kilter Lady Caroline Lamb. He found her irresistible, and being known for diving all in, he was ready to elope with her, when another of his lovers, the Lady Oxford, intervened. Did he truly escape the clutches of Lady Lamb, or was he entwined like the knots of Rapunzel's hair? That's the story for next week. The way Lady Oxford pulled Byron away was by appealing to his brain and his radicalism, which, as we all know, is the way to a young man's heart. Byron thanked her by starting up a proper affair with his half-sister Augusta, as well as another woman named Lady Webster. Juggling these two scenarios were said to leave Byron feeling horrifically guilt-ridden and extremely elated simultaneously, which drove him to write some really great poetry. Of course, that also meant he needed to change things. So he decided, hey, let's make the worst possible decision of all and get married to someone horrifically dull. He married Annabella Milbank, and in spite of the marriage being not so great, she gave birth to their daughter, who they named Augusta. Nope, that's not uncomfortable or awkward at all, especially since the whole world was talking about the fact that Byron was most likely having some flowers in the attic romps with the baby's aunt who shared her name. So, needless to say that the marriage didn't last, and Byron decided it was time to go where people will understand him, and he meets up with their good friends the Shelleys in Europe. Let's not forget that Mary Shelley's half-sister Claire is living with them at the time as well. She and Byron had had an affair before and could certainly have another. I mean, when in Rome? What happens in Geneva stays in Geneva? Something like that. We'll workshop it. The Shelleys returned to England after a summer in Europe, and Claire actually gives birth to Byron's daughter, Allegra. Byron stays in Europe with his friend John Hobhouse, and he takes up an affair with a baker's wife, whom he describes in letters as a gentle tigress. This, my friends, is exactly why he is the one they all still swoon for. Byron soon begins what would be heralded as his greatest work, and one of the greatest works of all time, Don Juan. The satirical poem allowed Byron to show all the facets of his personality in a way that turned society on its ear, highlighted his wit, his consciousness, his realism, his romanticism, his sadness, and more. It stands the test of time, in spite of the fact that he never actually completed the work. Eventually, debauchery and promiscuity took hold of our friend Byron, and he grew fat and gray, losing some of his luster, but a young countess named Teresa Guicciuccelli was still drawn to him and brought him back to Venice as her gentleman-in-waiting, where he became friends with her father and brothers. These relationships reignited his passion for social justice, and all of them engaged in uprisings. Eventually, the family was exiled, and Byron relocated to Pisa, where he reconnected with Percy and Mary Shelley and began working with Percy on The Liberal. Their reconnection was furious and deep, although brief. Percy drowned while sailing his boat in July 1822, aptly named the Don Juan for his friend. Some accounts say that the accident happened after racing Byron in bad weather. Regardless, at the funeral as his body was burned on the beach, Byron is said to have wept and wanted to keep Percy's skull as a keepsake. Following Percy's death, Byron threw himself into saving the world and became an agent of the London Committee, acting to assist the Greeks in their quest for freedom from Turkish rule. He headed off to Greece, ready to fight for their independence, and even helped fund the fight with 4,000 pounds of his own money. Byron made valiant efforts to unite the Greek forces and to fight, but was stricken by a serious illness at the front lines and was placed in the hospital. This illness would eventually take his life. Being Byronic until the end, he is said to have had at one point exclaimed out of delirium and half smiling amidst a host of chaos from onlookers and medics, shouting Greek, Italian, English, and God knows what else, and not knowing what to do. Questa un bella scena, or what a beautiful scene. Byron is said to have had 2 inexperienced doctors who were constantly bleeding him and draining his strength. One evening he turned to them and said, "Come, come, no weakness. Let's be a man to the last. Now I shall go to sleep." He rolled over, slept, and never woke. Lord Byron's body was returned to England, and he was buried at his family's home in Newstead. Because of his unconventional life, he was refused burial at Westminster Abbey, but 145 years later, a memorial to him was finally installed in the floor. Famous Last Words is written and narrated by Luke Poling. That's me. It is produced by Heidi Hegquist and myself. Our assistant producer is Sabrina Thompson. You can find the show on Facebook under Famous Last Words Podcast. You can follow us on Instagram, where we are at Famous Last Words Pod. And if you want even more famous last words, find us on Substack at Famous Last Words.